Okay, so get this. You sent us a transcript from a Lithuanian election debate,
Mm-hmm.
and it was held in a former prison.
Wow.
A prison.
Talk about setting the stage for some heated exchanges.
Right. Like, come on, who thinks of that? And if that wasn't interesting enough on its own,
Yeah.
the candidates each got to pick victory songs. Victory
Yeah.
song. And it wasn't just like a fun little thing they did. They also answered questions about their platforms. They had to field questions from the audience. It sounded like a very lively audience, by the way.
I bet.
And then they even had to do a rapid-fire trivia round.
That's a lot.
It's a really cool format.
Yeah.
And I can see exactly why you wanted us to look at this. Like, this is more than just talking about policy.
Yeah.
This is, you get to see how these candidates, like, present themselves, how they connect with voters.
Absolutely. It's a glimpse into their personality, how they think on their feet.
Exactly. So our deep dive today is going to be into this wild transcript that you sent.
Okay.
And we're going to try to unpack what are the core issues that are at stake in this election and give you a feel for who these candidates are.
Sounds good. And from what I've seen, personality definitely plays a role here.
Absolutely. So let's start with something that caught my eye right away. This whole anti-us thing.
Right.
You don't really hear a lot of political commentary about ducks very often.
It's not every day you see a duck in a debate.
Yeah.
The duck, or antis in Lithuanian.
Okay.
It's more than just a bird here. It's like this whole metaphor, right? It represents a potential coalition between the conservatives and the social democrats.
Okay, so like a political alliance.
Exactly. And you'll see 2G pop up as well.
Okay.
That refers to this potential coalition using the first letters of the conservative and social democrat leaders' surnames.
Huh. Clever.
So you have Ingrida Šimonytė, she's the conservative leader, and she really seems to like this whole duck metaphor.
Really?
Whereas Vilija Blinkevičiūtė, the social democrat, not so much. She's not really quacking about it.
So that explains all the back and forth I was reading about.
Probably.
It did seem like she was trying to dodge the whole duck thing.
Yeah, and that reluctance to embrace the metaphor, that speaks volumes.
Really?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It shows that there are some complexities there when it comes to building a coalition, you know? It suggests that maybe she has some reservations about this particular partnership,
Okay.
and maybe she wants to keep her options open a little bit.
Oh, that's really interesting. It just goes to show how even something kind of lighthearted, like a metaphor about a duck, can actually tell us a lot about what's happening in the political landscape.
Absolutely. And this tension between potential alliances,
Yeah.
that's something you see throughout the entire debate.
Speaking of tension,
Okay.
there was some stuff in here about education. And specifically, I noticed some people were concerned about a shortage of textbooks after they made some recent changes to the curriculum.
Right. Yeah. And this is causing a lot of anxiety for parents and educators. And they kept using this one school as an example, Linkuvos Gymnasium.
Okay.
And this school, they only had 17 graduates last year.
17.
Just 17. It's a small school.
Wow.
And someone brought it up as like a counter argument to this idea that we need bigger schools.
Mm.
So it really shows you this broader debate about how we're using our resources in education.
Mm.
Should we be investing in these big schools, or should we be finding ways to support the smaller ones, especially in rural areas?
Yeah. Yeah. It's a great example of how, like, a very specific local issue, with this one school can actually point to a much larger national debate.
Absolutely.
It seems like you just can't get away from conversations about education funding no matter where you go.
It's a big one.
Yeah, for sure. But moving on, let's see, there was a lot of talk about the economy, which, is pretty standard for an election, I guess.
Right.
But it seemed like in this one, there were some pretty big promises being thrown around.
Yeah, absolutely. Giving financial aid to young families and people who are trying to buy their first home, that seems to be a big focus for a lot of the candidates.
Mm.
And it makes sense when you think about it, because one of the other major concerns that kept coming up was this issue of declining birth rates and people leaving the country.
Oh, right, right.
So it seems like they're trying to, entice young families to stay put by offering them these economic incentives, hopefully address these demographic challenges head on.
So it's not just about the economy, it's really about the future of Lithuania.
Exactly, yeah. And speaking of the future,
No?
Things got a little heated when they started talking about energy subsidies, particularly for fossil fuel.
Now, that's interesting, especially with so many countries trying to move towards renewable energy sources.
Yeah, and it's a really complicated issue here, especially with the cost of heating in Vilnius. There's a lot of debate about what role things like biofuels and waste should play in their heating system. So it really highlights just how complex and how controversial these energy issues are in this
Yeah.
election.
It sounds like a microcosm of the global conversation about energy just
Yeah.
playing out on a national stage.
That's a good way to put it. And, while we're on the topic of complicated issues, we have to talk about family values. This always seems to be a point of contention in elections, no matter where you go.
Yeah, it's a big one.
And Lithuania is no exception. In the notes you sent over, you mentioned this partnership law
Right.
that seems to be particularly divisive. Can you remind me what that's all about?
Yeah, so the partnership law is basically about whether or not same-sex couples should get legal recognition. So it's really dividing people on how they view marriage and family.
Right. So it's tapping into this much larger conversation about, how you define a family. What role do more traditional values versus these progressive values play in society?
Exactly, yeah.
And then woven into all of this is this really interesting discussion about religion and morality.
Yeah. And what was that about a town that enthroned Jesus Christ? What was that all about?
So one of the candidates brings this up as an example. They don't actually name the town, though, but they're basically using it to show how strong religious values can lead to a better society.
Hmm.
They even mentioned a study that apparently shows that kids who live their lives according to scripture, they're less likely to commit crimes or have suicidal thoughts.
Wow, that's good. That's quite a claim.
It is.
Yeah.
But it just goes to show how much religion and ideas about morality are influencing this election. You can see this playing out throughout the debate, the way the candidates are using both secular arguments and appeals to religious values to try and win people over.
It's a good reminder that, when you have an election, you're trying to appeal to all kinds of people with different beliefs and values. So you're going to see a mix of messages like that.
Exactly. Now, switching gears a bit here, we have to talk about security. You can't have a political debate in this part of the world without talking about the war in Ukraine.
Right. It's a huge deal.
It's a major event that's affecting everyone. A lot of candidates talked about how important it is for Lithuania to keep supporting Ukraine, both with money and military aid.
Yeah.
And they also acknowledged how much the war has impacted Lithuania, especially when it comes to immigration and national security.
Right. Because on top of everything else, Lithuania has seen a lot more immigrants coming in, especially from Ukraine and Belarus.
Yeah, and that's raised a lot of questions and concerns about how to integrate these new arrivals into society. Some candidates were in favor of stricter immigration policies. They said they were concerned about national security and how to make sure everyone has access to resources, while others were saying that Lithuania needs to have strong programs in place to help these immigrants adapt to life in a new country and contribute to society.
So it's kind of a balancing act. You want to be compassionate, but you also have to be realistic about the challenges.
Exactly, yeah. And then it gets even more complicated when you bring in anxieties about national identity and preserving Lithuanian culture. Like, some people are really worried about immigrants using the Russian language.
I see.
They're concerned that the Lithuanian language and culture might be eroded.
It's interesting how these conversations about national identity always seem to come up when a country is going through a period of rapid change.
Yeah, it's a common thread. Before we move on to some of the lighter stuff, I did want to touch on one more thing about immigration.
Oh, okay. What's that?
It was interesting to me how some candidates were willing to talk about the potential downsides of poorly managed integration, even if it made people uncomfortable. Like, they even brought up the possibility of ghettoization, which to me says a lot. Like, they're not afraid to have a frank discussion about the complexities of immigration, even if it means talking about the difficult things.
It seems like they're trying to find that balance,
Yeah.
being welcoming, but also acknowledging the challenges that come with welcoming a large number of new people into your country.
Exactly. Now, how about we lighten the mood a bit? Remember those fun little details you mentioned, like how the candidates each got to pick a victory song?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Well, I found another gem when I was looking through the transcript: political bets.
Okay, now you have my attention. What kind of political bets are we talking about here?
Political bets.
Okay, now you have my attention. What kind of political bets are we talking about here?
So it seems like making these kind of quirky bets, it's almost a tradition in Lithuanian politics.
Really?
Yeah, like there's this one from 20 years ago. A European Union commissioner bet a Lithuanian ambassador 2 bottles of vodka
Wait, hold on. They bet vodka?
on the turnout for a referendum on joining the EU.
Wow. Okay, that's amazing. Who won?
Well, the commissioner, they were feeling optimistic, guessed a higher turnout, and ended up winning.
Of course.
But it's not always vodka. There's another story in here about a bank chairman who bet his plaid vest that the exchange rate wouldn't change when Lithuania switched to the euro.
He bet his clothes. This is too good. Did he lose?
He's actually still wearing that vest today.
Oh, no way. That's amazing.
And then there's a story about a bet involving lemonade between these two rival politicians.
Okay.
But the transcript's a little vague on the details. I'm not sure exactly what went down there.
So someone might still owe someone a lemonade.
It seems like it, yeah.
Yeah.
Though they weren't all about drinks. Last year, a couple of politicians made a bet where the loser had to treat the winner to dinner at a Michelin star restaurant.
Wow. Okay, that's high stakes. What's the point of all this? Like, it's really entertaining, don't get me wrong, but is there some deeper meaning behind these political bets?
I think so. On the surface, it just seems like, a fun little quirk. But I think it also shows you that under the surface, there's a lot of personal rivalry going on, a lot of political maneuvering, which adds this whole other layer to everything.
So it's not just about, like, the policies themselves. It's also about personalities, about the relationships between these politicians.
Exactly. And those relationships, they can really influence how things play out.
It's like we're watching a political thriller with a dash of quirky humor mixed in. And it's all happening in this debate transcript. We've got ducks, textbooks, religion, family values, a war, immigration, and even some political gambling thrown in for good measure.
Huh.
So as we're wrapping up our deep dive here, what are some of the key takeaways for our listeners? What should they be thinking about after going through this wild ride of a debate with us?
Well, I think the biggest takeaway here is that Lithuania is at a crossroads. They're facing some major challenges. Concerns about population decline, economic uncertainty, and then, of course, the war in Ukraine. And then on top of all that, you have these really divisive social issues like LGBTQ plus rights and the role of religion in society. It really reflects the struggle a lot of countries are facing, trying to figure out their identity in a world that's changing so quickly.
And it feels like the candidates are all trying to navigate this really complicated landscape,
Right.
while also appealing to voters who have very different ideas about what the future of Lithuania should look like. Some are making big promises about the economy, others are focusing on more traditional values, and then you have those who are even willing to talk about the potential downsides of change.
Yeah, absolutely. They're each presenting their own unique vision for Lithuania, trying to connect with voters on an emotional level and on a practical level.
So the big question is, how are voters going to respond to all of this? Will these economic promises be enough? Will concerns about things like security and immigration outweigh everything else? And how will this really interesting mix of traditional and progressive ideas, how's that going to play out at the ballot box?
That's the million-dollar question. And honestly, it's impossible to predict with any certainty. But by spending time with this debate, you've gained a much deeper understanding of the forces that are shaping this election.
That's a good point.
And that kind of understanding, that's invaluable in today's world.
Couldn't agree more. This was fascinating.